Check this.
Welcome back to Briefing History. Today, we're going to explore the reasons behind the colonist uprising that lead to the Revolutionary War. The essential question we're going to look at is, what were the causes and effects of the British policies from 1763 to 1774? We're going to dissect each one of these policies to see what happens that causes the colonists to, one, lash out, and two, eventually say, we're just going to fight the most powerful and known country in the world because we don't like what you're doing. First thing we're going to do is we're going to watch a short video about all the different policies that the British impose onto the colonies. This is just an overview, and then afterwards we're going to go and dissect each one of those policies together. That way we can get our notes and important information. So your goal while you're watching this video is to listen to what the historians are talking about. That way when we get to the notes part, you have some background knowledge and you'll be able to ask some questions as you're going through the notes.
What caused the American Revolution? Like many disputes, this one began over two things: money and respect. It all started in the 1760s, when the British government needed to pay for the French and Indian Wars and turned to the colonies for cash. The first thing they did was require the colonists to buy heavily taxed British goods like sugar.
Americans used sugar to make rum. This was one of the major products of the American economy. And when it became clear that this rum was going to be more expensive, the Americans objected. They wanted their cheap booze.
Parliament said, okay, we get it, and eventually repealed the Sugar Act in 1766, but continued to impose other taxes. In 1765, the government issued the Stamp Act.
The Stamp Act seemed like an even bigger deal than the Sugar Act. The Stamp Act said that legal documents, almost anything on paper, pamphlets, newspapers, playing cards, all of those things needed to have an official stamp that you had to pay for.
To get a stamp, the colonist had to pay a collector. They weren't happy about that.
You really didn't want to be a stamp collector at this point in American history. All the hatred was taken out on them. They had their houses attacked, they had rocks thrown at their windows.
The Stamp Act was eventually repealed, but in 1767, the British tried again with the Townshend Acts, taxing essential imports like paper, glass, and tea.
The Townshend Acts were more taxing. The Americans figured we got rid of the Stamp Act by protest. We'll get rid of the Townshend Acts by protest as well.
The British repealed the Townshend Acts, though they did pass something new, a Tea Act, which gave their own tea merchants a big advantage in the colonial marketplace. We all know how that ended. On December 16, 1773, the colonists dumped 90,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. The British were not happy, pushing back with laws designed to show just who was boss. The colonists hated these, calling them the Intolerable Acts. One, the Quartering Act, forced colonists to give British soldiers food and bedding.
The British figured that they were going to make a statement. We are the people who run this place, not you. The Quartering Act, the other Intolerable Acts, were really a test of strength to see who was stronger, who's going to govern in America. The British said it's us, and the Americans increasingly said, no, it's not.
The Intolerable Acts actually helped to spark something of an American us at a really critical early point of what comes to be the American Revolution.
On April 19, 1775, us versus them became reality as the American Revolution began with a shot heard round the world at Lexington Common.
We've watched that intro video. Now we can dissect the individual policies that the British impose onto the colonies. Now, the most important thing that we need to look at first before we get to those policies is, how did people see the colonies growing and expanding after the French and Indian War? So we have two different perspectives. We have the Native American perspective, and then we have the colonies perspective, and the people who live within those colonies. Now, the Native Americans, remember, we had different groups fighting on different sides. We had some fighting for the French, we had some fighting for the British. Now, Native Americans were fighting back against this British control because they still didn't want to be controlled by either one, but they had to pick a side because they couldn't sit on the sidelines and watch these two large countries fighting against each other in their own lands. Now, settlers feared that natives would kill them, so they would in turn kill them on sight. They wouldn't even ask questions. And something turns out from this negative connection between the colonists and the Native Americans and turns into something called Pontiac's War. Now, Pontiac's War is just Native Americans trying to fight against the British from expanding into the West, and it's ended pretty much by 1764. Now, on the colony side, we have the Proclamation of 1763, which I'm going to show you a map afterwards, but I want you to get the notes down first. So, settlers could not move past the Appalachian Mountains. Now, the Appalachian Mountains are in the western part of New York, Virginia, and the colonists were angry about this because they were just finished fighting a war so that they could move past the Appalachian Mountains and move into there and colonize that area. So they're a little confused with the fact that they just had this war that lasted for 9 years over something that they can't even do now. So you could understand their frustrations as colonists who were told, if you do this and we win, you'll be able to move into that land because we'll own it. And now, because the British don't want to spend the money to protect, as they would say, the colonies from Native American tribes who don't want them to move out west, the colonists are stuck essentially in the same place they were before the war, and they are a little bit angered by this because what they say, what were we fighting for if we fought for something and now we can't do it? Now we're going to look at the map that shows us what the 13 American colonies in 1775 look like. Now, if we look at the map, we have stuff in purple, green, and orange. Now, the stuff in purple are the New England colonies, right? So we just finished that project that you did before we talked about the French and Indian War, about the different sections of the American colonies. Now, we have New England. In the green, you have the middle colonies, and then again in the orange, you have the southern colonies. Now, if you look at those really dark gray areas up in the top left, it's the province of Quebec. So that was land that was not part of the British control. Now, if we look at that red line that runs all along from the top of Maine all the way down to the bottom parts of Georgia, right to the beginning top part of Florida. Now, that's the proclamation line of 1763. So essentially what it's saying is that this line that goes all the way from Maine down to the tip part of Florida is a line that the colonists cannot go past, and they cannot set up small towns, a colony. They can't do anything past that other than possibly hunt and maybe go on camping trips if that was something that they wanted to do. It's nothing permanent. That's the key. They can't create anything permanent past that line. Now, what angered the colonists the most is that before the war, before the French and Indian War, they weren't allowed to go past that line anyway because it was technically French land, even though the British thought that they had control over it. So now they were told, fight in this war. If we win, you can go past that line and you can settle new lands and have permanent settlements. And then at the end, the British are like, well, it's too much money to really protect you, so we're just going to say you can't go past that line, and if you do go past that line, you're going to be in some type of trouble. It could be a fine, it might be arrested, you might get arrested, but it's some type of punishment. So the colonists are, one, confused, and two, they're angry about it. Think of it this way. If you're in class and a teacher says, okay, you guys need to read chapters 1 and 2. You'll answer questions 1 through 10. And once you're done, you can have 10 minutes of free time at the end. Now, you read your 2 chapters, you answer the questions 1 through 10, and you're like, yes, now I have 10 minutes of free time. And you go up to the teacher, show them your answers, and they say, well, actually, what I'm going to have you do is I'm just going to have you keep going and read chapter 3 and 4 and answer the rest of those questions. Now, you would be very upset, and it would turn into something that probably would get you in trouble, because you're probably going to say, well, you told me I can do it, so now I'm going to do it anyway. The colonists did the same exact thing. They said, well, you just made us fight in a war, hundreds of thousands of us die, and now you're telling us we can't do it. So we're just going to do it anyway. How are you going to stop us if you're all the way in England? So this is kind of one of those beginning points of the colonists saying, you don't even live here, so you can't actually control us. So we're at the 10-minute mark of the video. So what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video, and I want you to review your Cornell notes. Okay, so I want you to go back through all the Cornell notes that you've taken from the beginning up until now. I want you to underline any important information. I want you to highlight any key terms. If there's any terms that you've written down from the video because you know it's important but you're not sure what it is, go ahead and look it up and put the definition in the side part of your Cornell notes. Take your time with this part. Take 3 to 5 minutes. Go over your notes, and when you're done, just hit the play button and come on back. What happens after the French and Indian War? The British and the colonists, they both have very different experiences. For the British, they are a country that's falling farther and farther into debt, meaning that they owe money to a lot of different people. And this continued debt is coming from the fact that they have to now protect the colonists from Native Americans who are starting to attack British colonies because they're not happy with the way that the French and Indian War went. Now, the Parliament, which is the government of Great Britain, decides that the colonists should have some part in creating this revenue or money to pay back these debts. Now, when you compare the British people to the colonists were the least taxed group in the entire empire, so it only made sense that they would have to pick up the slack, essentially. But the colonists had a very different viewpoint. And remember, I told you every time we have a situation that we look at, there's a bunch of different viewpoints. You have, in this situation, you have the viewpoint of the British, the viewpoint of the colonists, and you can even break the colonist viewpoint into two different parts of loyalists or patriots who are against the British government, and then you also have the Native Americans. So the colonists were actually proud of their participation in the French and Indian War, and in the end, they knew they were going to have to pay some type of taxes, but they didn't think that their taxes were going to be as extreme as what the Parliament had decided to implement in the colonies. They saw themselves as a different group of people than people that lived in Great Britain. Now you have to understand that these people are no longer just immigrants. The majority of these people have been living in America their entire lives. They were born here. And so they feel that they're different than the mother country of Great Britain because they've never lived there. And over time, the people of the British colonies are starting to come together and have more of a connection with each other than they do with Great Britain. The Sugar Act was pretty simple. The British would put taxes on goods like sugar coming into the colonies. And Great Britain had their own company, and France had their company, and other countries had their own company that would bring stuff to the colonies. And Great Britain said, well, let's put more taxes on those goods coming in from other countries, and we'll leave ours at the same price, making Great Britain's prices the cheapest one, and everybody else is going higher. Now, the colonists were not happy about that because the British used to be the most expensive. Now that they have to buy the stuff from Great Britain, things that they would produce with that sugar would then also go up. So anything that they sell maybe at markets would have to then increase because the items that go into it are increased. So it's just the same revolving thing that happens even today when prices of oil, they go up. That means then gas goes up. Then that means your parents have to pay more money to put gas in their car to go to work or go wherever. So everything has an effect, especially when it comes to our economy. This tax they tried to impose is the Stamp Act of 1765. Now, this is the first tax that's actually directed primarily at the American colonists. This has nothing to do with imports. This is just solely things that are happening in the colonies. So what happens is, if you look at the screen, we have that stamp. And anything that was made out of paper. So this could be a will, it could be a newspaper, a pamphlet, playing cards. It could be anything that has to do with paper. So anything that has paper now has to have this stamp on it, and you have to purchase this stamp. Think of it as like when you send mail out, you have to purchase stamps for it to be sent out. Well, it's kind of the same thing, except everything that you have that's made out of paper would have to have a stamp on it. So the colonists, again, are not very happy. So they decide they're going to resort to mob violence. So mob violence is when they have a large gathering of people and they do some type of violent act. It could be breaking into the stamp provider's house. It could be burning their house down. It could be tar and feathering. It could be anything that's a violent act against somebody that is in charge of the stamps or from Great Britain itself. Thousand Acts, the History Channel does a really good job of explaining it and breaking it down. So instead of listening to me talk, you guys are going to watch this video. And it's a really good one. The guy's a good speaker, and there's some good images that will help you guys kind of understand and solidify the information about this act and why this one was kind of one of those ones where it was one of those last breaking points for the colonists.
American colonists were generally peaceful and productive, but also a fiercely independent bunch. The British, however, not so keen on fostering that independence. Fed up by acts of dissent against their rule, the royal crown imposed severe taxes to show the colonies who was boss. These taxes were known as the Townshend Acts. And to better understand their creation and effect on the colonies, here are 5 things that you need to know. Before the Townshend Acts, the British passed a hated piece of legislation called the Stamp Act, which taxed anything made of paper in the 13 colonies. We're talking contracts, wills, deeds, newspapers, magazines, pamphlets, even playing cards. Boston protesters hanged their city's tax collector in effigy and ransacked his home. Many colonial merchants embargoed British goods until the tax was lifted. Less than a year after its introduction, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. This only encouraged England to come up with more creative ways to squeeze the colonies for more money. Meet Charles Townshend, British treasurer and all-around unpopular guy in the colonies. Townshend was a financial whiz, but a clueless policymaker. He calculated that England could raise a ton of revenue by placing a tax on colonial imports, such as lead, glass, paint, tea, and paper. His rationale was that the colonists would be more willing to pay taxes on imported goods rather than on items produced locally. He couldn't have been more wrong. The Townshend Acts drew colonial fury. The most effective fight against them came from a farmer in Pennsylvania. Alright, well, technically John Dickinson was a lawyer, but he published a series of essays under the pen name of A Farmer in Pennsylvania. Anyway, Dickinson argued that the Townshend Acts would set a dangerous precedent of taxation without fair representation in government. His letters unified colonial opposition against the British rule and influenced how Americans believed a government should behave. The ultimate showdown took place in Boston, where the Crown collected all taxes under the Townshend Acts. No one hated these acts more than the Bostonians, who relied on imports for their economy, and so they rioted. 4 British Army regiments moved to occupy Boston Harbor to maintain order in 1768. Alright, spoiler alert, the British occupation of Boston was a disaster. On the night of March 5th, 1770, tensions boiled over when 8 British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonial protesters, killing 5. One victim was Crispus Attucks, an African-American man widely considered to be the first American casualty of the Revolutionary War. The soldiers were arrested, but later acquitted after a convincing defense by their attorney, future President John Adams. News of the Boston Massacre spread like wildfire, priming the colonists for their eventual uprising against the British.
I know he talked about the Tea Act in the video, but in case you missed the most important parts, this is what you really need to know. So, for the Tea Act, the whole purpose of it was to bail out this company called the East India Company. Now, Great Britain was shipping goods back and forth to the colonies and back to England. And the East India Company was one of those companies. They were starting to fail. They weren't making enough money because other countries were able to import goods at a cheaper price. So, what Great Britain does is with this Tea Act, it gives the East India Company a monopoly on the sale of tea. Now, a monopoly means that they control the entire sector of whatever they're trying to sell. So, for example, if you were to try to go buy gas, and you could only buy gas at Racetrack, they could put their prices at whatever they want because you have no other choices. It's not like you could go to Sunoco or Circle K or 7-Eleven or any of these other places that you sell gas, because the Racetrack owns all of the gas stations. So the Tea Act does the same thing for British tea coming into the colonies. So if the colonists resist, again, another act that the colonists think that they can get rid of by their demonstrations or protests, and it leads to the Boston Tea Party. Come to the end of this lesson, so by the end of the video you should have completed your Cornell notes. This is a time where I want you to take to review your Cornell notes again. We took that time at 10 minutes, now at 20 minutes I want you to do the same. Once you double check your Cornell notes, continue and complete the other stations for this unit. And I will see you next time.